What are numbers? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What are numbers? Well, we use numbers every day. And what are they? Well, they're a creation that we made to be able to describe quantities of material objects in the reality. And we have words for them, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we have numerals, which are the, 1, 2, 3. We have the physical depiction of the number of units of a thing that correspond to the word number. So the numbers were created to be able to have a intellectual understanding and concept of a particular amount of units of a thing that have their own integrity. Doesn't matter what they are. That's where it began, and it began with 1 through 9. Right? There wasn't a 0. 1 through 9. Because 0, which was added later, is not actually affixed to an object. 0 does not actually describe an amount of anything. 0 is an abstract idea, and 0 is also a placeholder in a 4 digits. So that when we start counting 1 through 9, in order to go past 9 in a base 10 system, then you slide the 1 over to the left, as we all know, and then you have 0. So it says, really what the number 10 is saying is that you have a complete set of 9, and then 1 more, and that's where the 0 comes in on the right. And then so when you say you have 13, you're really saying is you have one set of 10, and then you have 3 more in the set. You have 10 plus 3, right? And then that goes on ad infinitum, which means to infinity and beyond. But 0 does not represent an actual number of objects in reality, as opposed to 1 through 9, which of course do. And then in order to make calculations, they created a system so that we don't need any more number designations. We can just create these digits that have a system. Once you understand, if you place the 1 in the 10 position, then it means that many sets. If you place it in the hundreds position, it means that many sets, and so on and so forth. Now, those aren't the only numbers that mathematicians have created. They've created a number of other ones. They've created number systems that describe negative numbers, right? So philosophically, negative numbers don't exist. They can't exist. You can't have a negative thing existing in the reality. You can't have a negative number of objects in the reality. But intellectually, when you start doing arithmetic, which is you take known numbers of objects and you start intellectually doing mathematical operations with them, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, you start doing intellectual calculations with numbers of things that represent actual units in the physical reality. When you start doing those, then you can start producing numbers that don't exist in physical reality. They don't affix themselves to an object in physical reality. Like if I say 5 minus 7 equals -2, well, I can't give you -2 apples. I can't point to the floor and say that's what -2 apples looks like. That's impossible. And there are other sets of numbers that have been created in mathematics, such as square roots and also negative square roots and other things like that, where they describe things. They're valid concepts, they're valid intellectual ideas, but they're not necessarily affixed to a physical object. Some are, some are. Like when you get to like pi, right? Like you go, 3.14, you get the square root of like, you do the circular calculations and you get to pi. Well, you're saying that that number pi, which never resolves, it goes on forever, the number, it doesn't end. But it's affixed to a fixed object, a circle, right? It's a description of a circle, even though that number never ends, right? So you can never actually look at an object except for infinity in reality and say, oh, that object never ends, right? You can't look at a physical object in reality except for reality itself. Reality itself, you can say, well, that's infinite. And of course, that's philosophically debatable as well. But let's say you did say that physical reality was infinite and that you wanted to assign a never-ending number to describe it, right? Now, mathematicians they'll say that's more like you're trying to find the unified field, unified equation, whatever. But the only physical object that could really truly say that you could fix an unending number to would be creation itself. Now, to say that an unending number can be fixed to like a circle, right? Like 3.14 is a calculation you can do with a circle. Well, that's an intellectual construct. That's like an intellectual understanding of other principles of what you're working with in that sense, because it has gone beyond what a number is. Because a number in its purest form is a simplistic way to assign a label to a unit that has its own integrity of something in the matter, in the reality. It's been elevated intellectual constructs, and that's where you start to do the arithmetic, and that's where you start to do all the calculus and all the different mathematical operations that we can do, which essentially mathematical operations are essentially the number version of philosophy. It's not one for one, but they're pretty close. Because mathematicians are really just using numbers to express intellectual perspectives on creation. But when we get back to it, the original numbers, 1 through 9, they're firmly affixed to labeling units and objects. Now, numbers can be used for all sorts of things. It's not just mathematical operations, it's not philosophical descriptions, or even like, deeper insights into things. We use numbers every day because they're efficient, they help organize things, they keep things moving along. House addresses, phone numbers, GPS coordinates, budgets, video game code. Numbers are one of the more useful intellectual concepts that mankind's ever figured out. Super useful. Now, like I said, philosophically, when you get out of the normal number range, the intellectual relationship to what the numbers are saying gets very different very quickly. And of course, that's a field for mathematicians. But as with philosophy, what you always find out in philosophy is that it is the overarching perspective on all the disciplines. Because the idea of philosophy is that you get to a point where you get into the study of studying. So everything is a subset of philosophy. When you become a true philosopher, it has to cover all the reality. Philosophy covers all reality. So it has to cover all intellectual, spiritual, physical, mental, all the disciplines. And at least it has to have familiarity or compatibility, because philosophy is the study of all. Now, it begins with the love of wisdom, but the love of wisdom, you find out, are routes that lead to transcendental perspectives, and then you find out there are many routes of transcendental perspectives that lead to the overall perspective, and it sort of simplifies when you go, well, everything just sort of gets philosophical when you get to a certain level of study in your field. And mathematics is one that makes it very clear and very mainly pretty elegant and way less emotional. And it begins with numbers. So numbers, they're simple at the beginning because it's just assigning a word and a numeric and a pictorial figure to an agreed upon set of objects, units of any nature in matter. It's a real thing. Like, it's a really, really practical thing from 1 through 9. And then once it expands out into the other versions of numbers that mathematicians have established, you start to get into essentially intellectual calculations, projections, insights, transcendental ways of thinking, calculations, and you really start to engage in spatial arrangement. You really start to engage in trying to figure out what the reality itself is made out of, how it can be cataloged, manipulated, calculated, alchemized, understood, harnessed, respected, like all these different things. But essentially, the only absolutely solid real numbers where you can look on the ground and say, that's one thing, that's two things, right, is 1 through 9. Like, you can't even look at the ground and go, that's 0 apples. Because 0, you could say that's 0 anything and point at the air. Unless you're saying it's the air, because then it would be at least some air. Right? And of course, numbers, even those numbers are dependent upon the definition of the limits of the object or the unit of the thing that you're discussing. But once you do have agreement on all those things, then 1 through 9 are exceptionally useful. And when you want to have more than 10 things, then 0 is exceptionally useful, especially for, digits. And then once you want to start understanding relationships between things in the reality in terms of very rational, logical, elegant number systems, then all of the other versions of numbers that come in are extremely helpful. And the ability to do mathematics like basic arithmetic, algebra, calculus, geometry, all these other mathematical disciplines become extremely useful and helpful. And like any other discipline, if you do it long enough and you get deep enough into it and you do it with an honest, truthful, time-based study, and you grow and grow and grow in it, eventually it's inevitably transcendental in nature, and then it gets philosophical, because any mathematician who stays in the game for a long, long time and is deep into it eventually bumps up against the unified theory, right? The unified equation, the one algorithm that can accurately mathematically describe existence, right? That's always waiting for every mathematician, lurking somewhere in the background of their mind. And so you start from 1, and then you go through them all, and then eventually maybe you end up back at 1, but in like a really sophisticated way. So what are numbers? They're a helpful, elegant, rational way to describe objects in our reality, and they can be further expanded into all sorts of intellectual manipulation, calculation, and basically science. They're a great, one of the great tools of science that humanity's ever discovered. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner, and I hope you have some fun.